Welcome back, America. We have our friend Rebeccah Heinrichs with the Hudson Institute, Senior Fellow, Keystone Defense Initiative Director, expert on Russia. Rebeccah, what did you make of the meeting, as best as you could tell, between the president and Putin?
Well, look, Mark, I mean, the president was smiling while at the same time you saw that amazing flyover with the B-2 bomber with the F-35 fighter jets. Remember, the B-2 bomber was the primary aircraft used when President Trump initiated the strikes against the illicit nuclear facilities in Iran. So it was a powerful message of strength, flew right over the head of Putin and the president while President Trump shook his hand. I thought that was a powerful message, demonstration of American air power and what we can do, military competency. And then whenever the two leaders spoke, President Trump said that there's no deal yet. He's not going to settle on a bad deal. It's either going to be no deal or a good deal. Putin, of course, tried to act like things were good and headed in the right direction, but there was no commitment made. And so we're going to see, the other thing I was going to say is that it's really important that President Trump powerfully said that he's going to talk to Zelensky and NATO members, that they have a huge say in this. They're the ones that are dealing with this. Primarily, it's in their, it's Ukraine, and then it's in Europe's backyard. And so President Trump wasn't going to make any commitments on their behalf without talking to them. And so we'll see how this goes. Of course, I believe that economic sanctions have to come next if Putin will not negotiate in good faith, which there's no indication that he will.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the big issues, I have to assume the big issues are territory and security. I mean, those are the two big issues. They've always been the two big issues. And but isn't it true you're a student of this area of the world? I mean, I read what Putin had to say several times, 5,000 words. It rambles on. Somebody else actually wrote it for him. He talks basically that Europe is Russian. I mean, he talks about Poland. He talks about Romania. He talks about, obviously, Ukraine. He talks about Lithuania. I mean, is this a guy that's going to adhere to some kind of an agreement? I mean, when it comes to Ukraine, when his eyeballs are beyond Ukraine even, despite his enormous military setbacks?
Putin has not given up on his imperialistic aims. Ukraine, he believes erroneously, wrongly, that it belongs to him, but he doesn't stop there. He's building up forces to threaten Finland, new member of NATO. He's got aims against the Baltic nations, great pro-American countries. Of course, Poland, he hasn't given up on the pieces of Poland, whole chunks of Poland. And so Putin hasn't really stopped, or, he hasn't stopped wanting more peoples and territory that he wrongly believes are his. The only thing that's going to stop him is if President Trump, and I think he will when he runs out of patience, imposes significant costs on Putin so that Putin no longer believes that he can achieve, increased territory and peoples. And remember, Putin also has taken over 20,000 Ukrainian children, Mark, and he has done this because he wants to, quote, re-educate them to make them pro-Russian. Obviously, the Ukrainian people want their children back. President Trump is aware of this, and so you can see just the inhumanity of President Putin, and that this isn't going to be something that's going to be solved simply because he comes to his senses, unless he is made to feel the pain and understands that he's not going to be successful.
I mean, this is a guy, Putin, who's also busy in the Arctic Circle, isn't he? Trying to build military bases and so forth. So his designs are not just on Ukraine, not just on Europe. Last time I checked, the Arctic Circle is not in Europe. His designs are worldwide, including, competing with us, limiting our navigable waters, limiting our access to other parts of the world, too. Are they not?
No, that's right. And in fact, Russia has been increasing its military collaboration, its training, its drills with the Chinese around Alaska, American state. And so that has increased with all kinds of naval drills, air drills with military aircraft over the last year. Really, it started increasingly under the Biden administration and continues to go. And so Russia really sees the United States as its number one foe, its number one threat. So Putin likes to flatter President Trump, but he also understands that he's trying to take what belongs to the United States. And so he does have aims that go beyond Ukraine. He wants the United States out of Europe. He doesn't like that President Trump has forced NATO to spend more on its defense. It's stronger than it ever has been. It's going to keep getting stronger so that Russia can't take the Baltic countries, can't take Poland, can't take Finland and Sweden, new NATO members. And so President Putin understands that it's only going to get worse for him while his economy continues to actually weaken. Sky-high inflation, workforce issues. And so President Trump really does have a lot of leverage here to make this painful for Putin.
The other thing Putin wants out of Ukraine is their rare earth materials, right? He wants their rare earth materials. He's in Africa trying to steal their rare earth materials too. I mean, this guy, it's just hard for me to believe that even if he reaches an agreement now with NATO, with Zelensky, that he's going to keep it once Donald Trump leaves office. Isn't that also his MO, that he doesn't keep deals?
No, he doesn't keep deals. He lied to President Trump over and over again during Trump's first administration on multiple treaties, the Open Skies Treaty, the INF Treaty. President Trump withdrew from both of those bilateral treaties with the Russians because Putin continued to cheat and lie. President Obama did not withdraw from them. It was President Trump who withdrew from them so that the United States was not disadvantaged due to Russia's cheating. And then Putin was the one lying to President Trump at the time. He has not changed. He will say whatever he thinks is necessary to outmaneuver the United States. And as you pointed out, Mark, one of his closest partners was the Iranians. So President Trump taking away the Iranian nuclear program and significantly degrading the Iranian military with the help with the Israelis degrades Russia's influence in the Middle East. But it has its hands in the Middle East. Of course, it's collaborating with the Chinese as well. And so this isn't going to stop with Ukraine. Ukraine is just the most acute issue. But really, Russia is after undermining and weakening President Trump in the United States of America.
When we come back, Rebeccah Heinrichs, there's a strange cabal of individuals in our country who root for Putin, who defend Putin, who thinks Putin is the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.